YouTube Ozic going the Go Downs is back with every single NFL team's most likely trade candidate this offseason leading up to the season. There's still going to be more trades, and I think it'll be pretty active right before the season during roster cut season as well. So excited to break this down for every team. Let's do it. Starting with the AFC East teams, let's get this very obvious one out of the way. The Dolphins still haven't traded Jalen Ramsey. We're expecting it to happen. There's been some talks about Jonnu Smith. I think ultimately he stays. We'll see. But Ramsey is the most likely trade candidate for the Dolphins. They don't want to eat any of his salary. They may end up having to. Value could range from 4th round or 5th round pick, I guess, depending on if they eat any salary. We'll see. Now, the Bills don't have a very obvious trade candidate. They may roll into the season without making a single trade. It's definitely possible, but I think the most likely one would be Curtis Samuel, who was very underwhelming for them last year. He did go into the season with a little bit of an injury, but he was a big signing last offseason. They want Keon Coleman to step up this year. I'm sure he'll do that. They added Josh Palmer. They added Elijah Moore. So more receivers in the room. Is there room for Curtis Samuel? I'd say yes, probably still part of their plans, but there could be interested teams. Maybe they feel like they'd rather have the pick than paying Samuel. Definitely possible. We'll see. The Jets will go Allen Lazard. There's a lot of talk about Breece Hall, and it's definitely possible, but who is more likely, maybe more likely to keep their star running back or a potential star running back? Allen Lazard, they reworked his deal where it's a little more team-friendly for them, or for an acquiring team. I think he'd be pretty cheap, a 6th or a 7th round pick. Would have been a 7th for sure, or a swap of picks, but because he took a massive pay cut, a team actually might be interested because it's a decent, experienced receiver. Patriots, I'll go Kendrick Bourne. They're one of their many receivers. You could go Antonio Gibson, one of their running backs as well, but Bourne has had some good play in his past, does have durability concerns, just not enough roster spots for all these receivers, so it makes sense to try to trade Bourne. There's a shot they may not be able to trade him or Gibson. They may have to cut those guys, but a decent experienced receiver could end up getting a late round pick for him before the season starts. The Philadelphia Eagles do not have an obvious one. They got a really good roster, a Super Bowl roster. They want to keep it together. Dallas Goedert is the most likely. I just don't see it happening at this point, even though a couple months ago it felt like, yeah, this is probably going to happen. But my take was they wanted around a 4th round pick. They were only getting offered, a 5th. They didn't love his contract. They reworked his contract. So that's appealing to the Eagles, but it also could be appealing to other teams. So I think if a team comes around and offers a 4th, the Eagles could consider it. But Goddard has showed up in some big-time moments in big-time games, especially in the playoffs. So most likely, I think the Eagles keep him and the rest of their guys at this point. Commanders, Andrew Wiley, who started at right tackle for them last year, they draft a young promising player in Josh Connerly. Laremy Tunsil was added to the left spot. They could keep Wiley, a very good, important backup for the tackle spot, could fill in at guard. It's definitely a possibility, but they can get something out of him. There's always teams desperate for offensive linemen, especially right before the season. Maybe somebody else gets hurt for somebody. So they might be able to flip him for a decent pick, save some money. They traded away some picks somewhat recently, so could get those picks back. A guy to watch. The Dallas Cowboys do not have a super obvious trade candidate, but Robert Jones, an interesting to watch. Very interesting, actually, because they just signed him in free agency. Kind of a big signing. He was in line to start. He's not the best guard, but a decent guard with experience. He's capable of starting, but they have Tyler Smith, and they drafted Tyler Booker, who was a big-time guard. They drafted him pretty high. Obviously, they're very highly on him. They're going to start the 2 Tylers, and unless Tyler Smith starts at left tackle, which he's very capable of doing, then they'll keep Robert Jones. But if Tyler Smith continues to start at guard with Tyler Booker at guard, another Tyler Guyton, who was a little underwhelming but a high raw upside prospect from last year, is in line to start at left tackle. So Robert Jones, a very important backup to them, but there's a team that could use him as a starter, so they may throw. The Cowboys will say a 5th round pick is definitely possible, and the Cowboys may want to jump on that as they traded away some draft picks somewhat recently. Obviously, last year from Mingo, George Pickens recently. So an interesting name to watch. The Giants will go Devin Singletary, their running back, who's a little bit more down the depth chart now, because remember they have Tyrone Tracy, who passed them up during the year, and Cam Skadaboo, who could be an absolute stud right from the get-go for them. I thought about putting Evan Neal here. It's definitely a possibility, but I think Singletary is more likely. An experienced running back's been decent in his career. There's probably going to be injuries. There's probably going to be teams looking for running backs still. I definitely could see that before the season starts. I think it's pretty likely, actually. that they can add a later day 3 pick for him rather than just giving them away for just releasing them. So another one to watch. Ravens don't have a super obvious one. It's a very good roster. They like their roster. It's a Super Bowl-like roster. They want to run it back probably. So not necessarily a trade going to happen for the Ravens. But David Ojabo, who's been very underwhelming, obviously unfortunate injury heading into his draft process, really. And it really has affected him. And he's not the best versus the run. He's just hasn't been able to stay on the field consistently and make that much of an impact. But there's probably teams out there that are going, yeah, there's not enough room for him on that Super Bowl-like roster, but we'll take him. We liked him, pre-draft. We'll develop him. We think he has upside. There might be a team that kind of gives up a decent pick. The problem with this one is compensation. I think it would be a 6th, or maybe teams would only offer a 7th because the injury he had going into his career, and he just hasn't really done anything. But even with a 6th, the Ravens may go, we'll pass. We'll just hang on to him. So that's a tricky position there. Ravens, really good roster. Probably want to roll with it. Don't have any obvious ones. The Bengals, I think we got to go Trey Hendrickson. I mean, my stance is they're going to keep him. They're stubborn, and I'll still roll with that. But as time goes on here and they still haven't given him a raise or an extension, I guess every day maybe it grows more and more likely. I know there's teams out there still that are interested. Some teams that actually, maybe the Commanders, an example, that kind of stayed pat on not adding a pass rusher because they were interested in trading for a guy like this. So there'll definitely be some teams interested. The Bengals wanted a first-round pick. Don't think they're going to get that, especially the longer they wait. They're not going to get that. It's either going to be a second round and more or a second-round pick. But yeah, I mean, the Bengals are being stubborn with him and their first-round pass rusher in Shamar Stewart. So we'll see what ends up happening. I'm kind of getting sick of it, if I'm being honest. The Steelers do not have an obvious one at all. I went a little outside the box here. A guy they just signed this offseason in Kenneth Gainwell. So at that time, they had Kenneth Gainwell and then Jaylen Warren. Obviously, they brought him back, and they drafted Caleb Johnson. Great draft pick. I think he's going to be awesome. Perfect fit. Gainwell's the third running back. I think for sure the third running back. Now, they might want to rotate. They'll use all of them, right? It's definitely possible. They just signed him, but there might be a team out there. There's some teams that could use a running back. He could possibly be a second running back for a team. They might be interested in him as a special teamer. The Steelers definitely could still be. I'm not sitting here saying they're going to trade him, but I actually think if I had to pick someone, and there's some rumors about TJ Watt is either a most likely trade candidate. That's a little bit more of a long shot. But I'd say Gainwell could be one to watch if teams are interested for running backs right before the season starts. The Cleveland Browns actually had a few that could have made this video. I went Joe Flacco. I strongly considered Jerome Ford, another decent running back that's getting moved down the depth chart. I think teams could be interested. Yeah, 50-50 here, going Flacco or Ford. But also Greg Newsome, there's been some rumors. That'd be a little bit more of a surprise than these other two. But I think at the end of the day, the Browns aren't going to carry 4 quarterbacks into the season. They're going to keep the 2 rookies. And there's some, a little buzz about Kenny Pickett maybe being the starter. It could be Flacco. But they traded for Pickett for a reason, I feel. Do they just turn around and take less for him than what they gave up for him just a couple months later? Doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think there'll be teams that are actually very interested in having a quality backup at Joe Flacco, but also having his brain in the room, maybe behind or in a room with a young, maybe a rookie or second-year quarterback. So I think teams will be itching to trade for Joe Flacco, possibly Jerome Ford, though, as well. So the Browns, a very good one for this exercise. The Lions are another team that they don't have a super obvious one, but I will say DJ Reader could be a sneaky one to watch. Not saying it's going to happen, but a good experienced defensive tackle, does have durability concerns. He didn't play his best football last year, but still good. And the Lions have a number of defensive tackles. Ali McNeil's a star. He's coming back from injury. They brought back Onwuzurike. They drafted Tyleik Williams in the first round. Kind of feels like a Reader replacement. Doesn't have to be now. It could be next year. Roy Lopez they signed. He is a very underrated nose tackle. And they have a couple other young options they drafted over the years as well. Wingo Martin. So I don't know how all these guys are going to get snaps. They did suffer a lot of injuries there, so maybe they're just being extra careful because it's a very important part of the Lions, stopping the run. So that's definitely could be the case. But they can move Reader for a decent pick Tricky to figure out compensation. 1 year left on his deal. Does have durability concerns, so will teams be willing to give up a 4th-round pick? Maybe not. The Lions did pay his bonus. Not the end of the world if they trade him, but they did pay his bonus already, so it might have to be worth it, obviously, for the Detroit Lions. So an interesting one to watch, even though it's not super likely. The Vikings don't have a super obvious big name, but Brian Asamoah, a young linebacker, could be one to watch, mainly because he's getting a little bit more down the depth chart. They're pretty good at linebacker. He hasn't fully worked out for them, but a solid special teamer, and that might be important enough to them. But he was also involved in trade talks in the recent past. Nothing ever happened, but there was some in the past. Not worth a ton. Could be a swap of picks. Could be a cut candidate. Even the Vikings like their roster, so they're not going to trade one of their, bigger name guys. They do have a long list of corners that they've brought in on top of what they already had, so could one of those guys be dealt? We'll see. But I thought Asamoah made the most sense as most likely. Interesting one here for the Packers because it's a very solid player, Romeo Doubs, their receiver, one of their better receivers. But at the end of the day, I was going to put a receiver in this video for the Packers because the question is, can they keep all of them? They drafted 2. It's a very deep room. Could it be Christian Watson here? I'd say Doubs more likely. Could it be Dontavian Wicks? He has another year on his contract after this year, so maybe they want to give him more of a shot. Guy like Doubs, expiring deal going in this year. They suspended him a game last year. There was something with him and the coaching staff. So could they be a little more willing to push him out, even though at times he feels like their best receiver? So we'll see, but a solid receiver that could possibly be had for the right price. Maybe not a super likely candidate, but one to watch. Really monitor the Packers receiver room going into the season because I suppose they could keep all those guys, but will they? The Bears, a free agent signing of theirs this offseason, Olamide Zaccheaus, I think a very interesting one to watch. I think it's very possible heading into the season. He had maybe the best year of his career with the Commanders last year. Very solid, very productive, showed up in some big moments. So the Bears we need a slot receiver, very important for Ben Johnson's offense. So they signed him. They didn't bring back Keenan Allen. They signed him pretty good. Add him in the mix with DJ Moore, Rome Odunze. Then the draft hits, and they take Colson Loveland, who's a tight end, but he can play the slot spot. He can play out wide. Then they draft, more importantly, Luther Burden, who's a big-time slot receiver. This pushes Zaccheaus down the list a little bit. And, it's be a damn good depth receiver. I think he believes, and other teams believe, he could be a starter somewhere. The Bears may be able to flip him for like a 5th-round pick. That'd be pretty solid for them. It almost feels like they signed a trade piece, perhaps, if they knew they had an idea they were going to get a guy like Burden in the draft. So I think this is one that not going to happen soon, I don't think. You kind of go through preseason around the roster cut deadline, and then teams that need a receiver, specifically a slot receiver, might jump on this. So one to watch. Texans had a couple. I look at Dameon Pierce, who was kind of brought up in trade talks or trade rumors, at least in the past. He got moved down the running back depth chart with them adding Nick Chubb and Woody Marks through the draft. And they have Joe Mixon starting, obviously. Could end up being somewhat of a surprise cut candidate or just a cut candidate. John Mechie, involved in trade talks in the past. The Texans decided to hang on to him because young with upside, so teams might see that as well. Texans traded for Christian Kirk, and they drafted both pretty good Iowa State receivers in Higgins and Knoll, on top of them having one of the best in football, Nico Collins. So pretty crowded receiver room. It definitely could be time for John Mechie to go. There could be a team interested for a late day 3 pick. The Colts didn't have a super obvious one, but their edge room is pretty loaded right now. I was eventually going to go with Abukum or Kwity Paye here, but Paye, young with upside, semi-productive. Abukum was out last year. I think Abukum was brought in for specifically Gus Bradley's defense. He's kind of always fit that style defense with your Leo pass rusher on one side, which Abukum has fit that role when he was in San Francisco and then when he was with the Colts. So maybe he is that 4th option out of the edge group, and he could be on his way out. It's definitely possible. They also could keep all of them. Latu's had his durability concerns in the past. Paye's been a little underwhelming, but still decent. And then they draft Tui Maloa, who I'm a huge fan of. I think he'll be awesome for the Colts. So Abukum could be the guy on the way out because they can get something for him. I'd say around a 5th-round pick, but we'll see. Titans, I'll go Will Levis. I think this one ends up happening. I think it's somewhat of an obvious pick here for the Tennessee Titans for me. You look at last year, I don't think Brian Callahan liked Will Levis at all. I just kept wanting to bench him in press conferences, post-game press conferences. Almost felt like he threw him under the bus, like blaming, all the struggles on the quarterback play specifically. So it was a weird first season for Brian Callahan, the Titans, and Will Levis, who actually looked, I look at 2 years ago when he got thrown into a bad situation, he looked pretty damn promising. Like, I mean, this guy might be better than everyone thought, and that was not the case last year. So that can result in a team maybe being interested in him. And typically when these young quarterbacks that still have upside get traded, they end up bringing in more compensation in terms of trade than people would think. So I think there's going to be an interested team, I should say, out there for Will Levis. So wanting to monitor heading into the season. The Jags do not have a super obvious one, but there were some rumors. I don't know if there was actual talks, but rumors about them trading Travis Etienne at the deadline last year. So it's possible, again, they do have Tank Bigsby, who looked awesome last year, and then they draft Tootin as well. But I could see Etienne being the best running back. I still think he's the most skilled running back on that team, but being the best in that Liam Cohen offense. Remember, he had a duo with Bucky Irving and Rachaad White in Tampa, so he might just want to roll Etienne and Tank Bigsby and Tootin kind of be on the shelf, rotating here and there for now. Maybe work on the ball security. So that could be the case. But also, they might just like Bigsby, or maybe Bigsby could be here. I thought Armstead could be an option. Devin Lloyd be a little bit more of a surprise, but yeah, just because the running back room's a little crowded and there was a little chatter about Etienne last year. Most likely the Jags kind of roll with all these guys, but we'll see. A skilled running back that kind of had an off year last year. The Buccaneers, you got to go with Jamel Dean, who's a very solid, experienced corner, just has a lot of durability concerns. And then they have Zion McCollum, and then they drafted a couple corners, Morrison and Parrish. So they could move on from Dean. There are some teams interested in adding a corner still, maybe looking for Ramsey first, but teams missed out on Alexander. Shaq Griffin just got signed, so team could be interested in Dean. Tricky to figure out compensation, because if you're a good, experienced corner, durability concerns comes with the contract. Maybe the Bucs want to start him again this year and let the rookies kind of sit and learn behind him. We'll see, but I think it's a decent player. It's possible that he could be dealt before the season. The Falcons, we got to go. Kirk Cousins has been talked about it all offseason. Actually seems a little less likely. There's reports that Cousins and the Falcons are just looking to move forward. He's gonna mentor Michael Penix. He's gonna be there. And now the Steelers added Aaron Rodgers. I thought Kirk Cousins was plan B. Maybe Rodgers wasn't going to sign there. That's not the case now, but still a good, experienced, smart quarterback. He was going into the year with an injury last year, and then he dealt with an upper body injury during the year it came out, apparently. So he can get back on track. There could be more injuries before the season starts, so it's definitely still possible. Or a team that is a little more likely to play Cousins, or maybe he's a little more likely to eventually play. Or the Falcons just may very well just really want to keep him because Penix had his injuries in his college career as well. So we'll see what ends up happening with Kirk Cousins. Some talk about Kyle Pitts as well. I think Cousins might be a little bit more likely just because the Falcons want a day 2 pick for Pitts. Maybe they'll come down on that. That becomes a lot more likely if they could drop that asking price down a little bit. But I don't know if the team's going to give up that right now. Saints, another team that they don't have a super obvious one here, but running back Kendre Miller, he's still very young from TCU, has not lived up to expectations, been very underwhelming, but could turn. He still was one of the younger prospects in that draft class, so could turn it around under Kellen Moore this year for sure. Behind, maybe he wins that running back 2 job behind Alvin Kamara. They did draft Devin Neal, though. I feel like Miller ends up sliding down the depth chart a little bit. There could be a team interested in him for a very late day 3 pick. It's definitely possible the Saints didn't have an obvious, they're going to trade this guy type of guy. Panthers, yet another team, not a super obvious trade candidate. I went with Shai Tuttle, though. Contract is now very tradable. They added other interior defensive linemen, and Derek Brown is coming back. Tuttle's been a little underwhelming. He could be dealt for a later day 3 pick, but we'll see if maybe they just want to keep him just to have. Derek Brown got injured last year, just to have the options on the defensive line. But yeah, not a super obvious one for the Panthers. That was the one that stood out if I had to say most likely. The Chiefs, I'll go with Sky Moore, their young receiver who's been underwhelming. I mean, he's been on the field though. Chiefs seem to like him as a blocker at times, but in terms of getting open and catching the ball consistently, running the right route consistently, it's been inconsistent. It's been a problem, and weird because that seemed to be a strength out of college, and they just keep adding more receivers. You got Rashee Rice coming back from injury. Hollywood Brown going to start the year healthy. You have Xavier Worthy who's emerging. They draft Jalen Royal. I mean, they have a number of guys. So Moore getting knocked down the depth chart. There could be a team interested in that was kind of high on him pre-draft out there. Is there room for all those receivers for the Chiefs? How about Wanya Morris as well? Sky Moore might be a little more likely. That'd be an interesting trade if it happened. The Chargers, a very interesting one here. Zion Johnson, and it's interesting because he could end up being their starting center. He has been a starting guard for them. With the new staff, they don't love it. They want to work him in at center, and we'll see how that goes. He could end up starting there. He's a young, still talented. He's had good moments. But he could start at center, but they have guys like Bradley Bozeman who can play center. They brought in Andre James as well. Bozeman can also play guard. So it's an interesting situation there. And they brought in Mekhi Becton, who's going to start at guard. Jamari Sawyer, who's a solid guard as well. They're obviously set at tackle. So weird situation. I think there would be teams dying to get him for the right price out there. And they are free to start him at guard or at center. I think more likely guard. He's more likely, if he stays with the Chargers, he's more likely to play center. It feels like at this point, still a long offseason, still a long, training camp, preseason. But again, could start for the Chargers, could be a serious trade candidate as well. For the Broncos, I'll go Jaleel McLaughlin. Not that they'll for sure trade him or anything, but the running back room seems to be a lot deeper. They draft R.J. Harvey. They drafted Audric Estime last year, but they draft R.J. Harvey this year, solid running back. And then they signed J.K. Dobbins. Peyton likes to rotate them all. He likes to use a ton of running backs, so maybe he wants to keep as many good ones as he can. But McLaughlin's had some really good moments. There's a team out there that maybe goes, hey, if we actually use this guy as a consistent running back too, not just a mixed in there, he might be pretty good. So a team might be willing to throw even our 6th round pick, and the Broncos may go, hey, probably our 4th running, or maybe he beats out Estime for the 3rd running back. Or maybe Harvey just isn't ready yet. Maybe he's a gadget guy at first. I'd say probably not, but maybe that. So we'll see. It's not a super obvious one here for the Broncos, but running back room is pretty deep. Could it be Estime that gets traded? Probably not. I'd say McLaughlin's the most likely one. Could one of those corners like Damari Mathis be available? We'll see. The Raiders had a couple ones. I thought Zamir White stood out. There's been some talks over the last, several months. I feel like maybe even going back to the trade deadline last year for him being dealt. Had some flashes 2 years ago, so there could be a team out there. But there's actually been legit discussions with Michael Mayer. It's kind of quieted down a little bit, but he is at best a second tight end for the Raiders. And he was a star at Notre Dame, like an absolute stud. And there could be a team out there just dying to get him, for a pretty cheap cost. I think it'd have to be the right price for the Raiders to trade him. They probably wouldn't accept that 6th round pick. I don't see. Could they demand a 4th? I don't think a team's going to give that up. But there's been talks, but it's kind of quieted down. We'll see if it actually happens. I think it's possible. 49ers, not a super obvious one. I mean, there's some Brandon Ayuk chatter, but is that a most likely trade candidate? I think it's one of these smaller guys that are borderline cut candidates. Not big name guys. I'm saying Jordan Elliott is one that kind of stands out. Hasn't really lived up to his expectations. The 49ers drafted a couple solid defensive tackles. Even their 1st round pick, Michael Williams, plays edge, but he actually could slide inside and play inside as well. So I don't know how many snaps really, and he wasn't getting a ton as it was. I mean, he played, but they were weak there. They were thin on guys, but that snap count's really dropping is my point. So this is a roster bubble type guy that they could eventually trade right before the season starts. The Rams absolutely do not have a obvious trade candidate. You almost have to force one here in a way, but it's interesting if you think about it with the running backs, because you could say Kyren Williams, their star running back, because they cannot reach a deal on an extension, but there's some confidence, some positive talks. He's a star running back for them. He gets the full load. Most likely they're not going to trade Kyren Williams, right? Then you have Blake Corum, who, they liked enough to draft in the 3rd round last year. We barely saw any of them during the year. It felt like we saw some of him here and there. He was this super big name out of Michigan, won the national championship game, but didn't really see a whole lot of him. And the Rams Sean McVay and the Rams are one of those teams, they use running. They're not a team that's going to go deep. They're not going to rotate the backs. They're definitely not going to use their 3rd running back, that's for sure. That's just how Sean McVay has been. So if they keep Kyren Williams, Blake Corum is running back too, but maybe not so fast. Jarquez Hunter, they drafted this year from Auburn, and most people would say Corum probably is ahead of him, and that could be the case, but I don't know if you saw any, Sean McVay, his reaction with Hunter, going into that pick, he loves Jarquez Hunter. Like, he really, really likes him. I felt like the same feeling how he was with Kyren Williams going in the draft. So, do they feel, and they just draft him in the 3rd round, you know? I don't think a team's going to throw him a 3rd round pick, but there still could be a team high on Blake Corum, because as long as we just use him, I think he'll be effective, teams might say. I do think he was a little overhyped going in the draft, but there might be a team out there that would give him a 4th or a 5th round pick. Is it worth it for the Rams? Are they even going to play him? Are they going to play Hunter? So, first glance, it's like they're not going to trade anybody, but I think it's a pretty interesting situation with the running backs in general in LA. For the Seahawks, I have to go with Noah Fant. I think this is somewhat realistic. I'm not saying it's for sure going to happen, and he could actually, again, not saying it's going to happen, but could be a surprise cut candidate just because, I mean, he's good. He's been a little underwhelming. They have other tight ends, and they could free a bit of space. But I think first they would look to trade him. But A.J. Barner looked pretty damn promising. He impressed me. They draft Elijah Arroyo, who could align more like a receiver as well. So they could feel the need to keep all these tight ends, but they could get something out of them. I know expiring deal, needs an extension, a little pricey, somewhat pricey, been a little underwhelming, even though good, but there could be a team for the right price interested in trading for Noah Fant, so one to watch. In the Cardinals, I'll go with defensive tackle Justin Jones, who was somewhat of a bigger free agency signing for them not the free agency that just passed, year before. It played a little bit, then got injured, and so they thought somewhat highly of him, right? And he's been an experienced, decent player, played pretty well when he played for the Bears at one point. But since then, they've added a number of defensive linemen that I think are just better. You know, I think they're just straight up better. I think the Cardinals think that as well. So Bilal Nichols is another one, you know, maybe to keep an eye on. Not both, but one or the other. I think Justin Jones is a little more likely. I think there could be teams interested. So is there enough room for all these guys? Do they still want to give Justin Jones a go because they liked him so much to sign him to a decent contract last free agency? So I think it's maybe a little more realistic than people think, but definitely a position group to watch because Cardinals went from a weak defensive tackle group to it's kind of looking deep right now. I'm excited I got Walter Nolan, Dalvin Tomlinson. I'm excited for the group that they're putting together in this Jonathan Gannon defense. It actually could be a sneaky, damn good defense, but Justin Jones could be one to watch. So that wraps it up for this video. All 32 teams. Some of these a lot more likely than others. This is a type of video that I haven't done before. We do a lot of trade videos, so I was really excited about this one. Let me know your guys' thoughts. Let me know if you would change 1 or 2 or 3, however many, in the comments. I'd love to see what your thoughts, your edits, your changes are. So let me know. That's going to do it. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.